If you're an average Joe like me, you've probably never visited the beautiful islands of Okinawa, a subtropical island chain located just off the coast of Taiwan, China, and south of mainland Japan. And if you've never been there, you probably never would have known that this island chain was actually called the Ryukyu Kingdom for nearly 500 years until Imperial Japan forcibly annexed it in 1879. Okinawans, or Lushu people as a few of them like to be called, are very different from mainland Japanese, as they have their own language, culture, and history. In fact, from the 15th century to the 20th century, the Ryukyu Kingdom independently governed itself, even though it was officially a tributary state under the Chinese imperial system, and later in the 17th century, it would become an unofficial Japanese vassal after a murderous invasion of its islands by Japan. However, during the Ming Dynasty, the Ryukyu Kingdom flourished as a result of it being one of the few nations given special trading permission by the Ming courts. Because of China being China, a seriously bureaucratic country even 600 years ago, the Ming Dynasty heavily regulated its maritime trade, and therefore only special nations who paid tribute to China were allowed to trade with it. So because of its disinterest with its sea lanes, at that time, Chinese vassals like the Ryukyu Kingdom could basically act as a trading post for China, which means they were able to accrue massive sums of wealth. Now, why am I talking about Ryukyu and Okinawa, and why is any of this important or relevant today? Well, putting aside all the propaganda that Western outlets are putting out recently, even a YouTube video was made by the popular Kings and Generals channel just 2 weeks ago about the supposed history of Okinawa, which is really weird because that's totally not what Kings and Generals is supposed to be about. But anyways, brushing aside the predictable info warring from the West, the main important point that they don't want you to know about is that Okinawa was never officially part of Japan until 1879. In 1879, Imperial Japan decided to send troops over, kidnap its king, and force him to officially sign over the kingdom. That means Okinawa, or the Ryukyu Kingdom, is arguably an occupied nation, and surprise, surprise, it is flooded with US military bases, and get this, during the Cold War, the first one, it was minutes away from launching nuclear warheads on China. I fucking kid you not. I know this is a lot of disgusting to handle in a few minutes, but let's add some more history to balance things out a little bit. Before 1879, a Japanese warlord of the Satsuma region was able to conquer the islands after its horrific 1609 samurai invasion, full of beheadings and whatnot. But after they conquered the islands, they pretended that the Ryukyu Kingdom was still part of the Ming tributary system, so that the Japanese were able to use the Ryukyu Kingdom to obtain those coveted Chinese goods at a cheap rate. At the time, the Ming Empire knew all along what had happened, but played along with the charade because the Ming was very weak at that time and couldn't take other measures. So after hearing that extremely brief history of Okinawa, why do these islands matter so much today in these geopolitically crazy times? Well, it's because Okinawa is basically a sawed-off shotgun pointed right at China's nuts. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say that. Put another way, Okinawa and its huge array of forced US bases has all the prerequisites of being the next Ukraine, along with Taiwan province, which is literally right next door. So while its subtropical beaches are gorgeous and basically the dream for any traveler, it is also literally the tip of the nuclear armed spear for the US war machine. You know how US politicians love to say pretty little things like, "We aren't containing China." They're saying this while at the very same time literally pointing hundreds of missiles at China from idyllic islands just a few hundred miles off its coast. If that doesn't scream another Ukraine, then I have no idea.
大事な場所を結構基地にされちゃって、その脇のところで沖縄県民ずっと暮らしてきたので、埋め立てとかしざるを得なかったみたいな歴史もあるんですが、辺野古の海もとても綺麗な場所なので、やっぱりそういうところがこうどんどん基地にされるっていうのは結構辛いものがあるなっていうふうには考えて、これ以上開発ではなくて、今ある自然を生かした共存できる生活をこれからしていきたいなっていうのは結構私たち若い世代の中では結構ある。
やっぱり日本を軍事力を維持するためには必要だっていう、特に中国と近いっていうこともあって、やっぱり沖縄にしか置けないんじゃないかっていうのは。
結局米軍は別に守らないっていう風な沖縄県民、そこにあったとしても別に沖縄県民を守らないっていう話を聞いて、逆にウクライナみたいな感じでその基地があるところが攻撃されるっていう方がなんかリスクなんじゃないか、あっても意味ないんじゃないかっていうふうに思いますし、中国と歴史的に戦った歴史はないんですね。ずっと貿易で平和にやってきてるので、中国脅威論ってもうなんかなんだろうな、なんで今も言ってるのみたいな感覚になってる人も結構いると思います。別に私もアメリカ人が嫌いなわけではない、結構結婚してる友達とかいるんですよ。沖縄の人たちとこう出会いがあったりするとか、そういうのはいいのかなと思いますけど、基地はあまりやっぱり必要ないんじゃないかなっていう感覚です。アメリカ文化があることによって面白いものが生まれてるっていうのはあると思うんですけど、でもそれ以上に騒音だったりとか、水の汚染の化学物質がこう垂れ流されたりとか、そういう問題があまりにも多すぎるので、こう暴力の話とか、いいっていうところよりも、やっぱそういう問題意識の方が強いです。
We're therefore very lucky to have him join us here at the Center for Japanese Studies to teach our students, contribute to our scholarly community, and help us rethink what Japanese studies can and should be as we revisit the legacies of the past 75 years. I'm therefore incredibly excited to learn from Dr. Yokota as he helps us imagine the futures our center might pursue and how best to expand and improve the field of Japanese studies more broadly. Today, Dr. Yokota will be presenting a talk entitled Okinawan Independence and Autonomy Debates in the 1980s. So with that said, please join me in welcoming CGS postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Ryan Masaaki Yokota.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Professor Jackson, for this probably a too nice introduction, I might. So to begin with, I wanted to talk just a little bit about sort of how and where I enter into this discussion. And I think that from me, myself, I come from a particular sort of heritage background. On my father's side, I'm a direct descendant of people who survived the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima, and also of people who were incarcerated in the United States in the Japanese American incarceration sites. On my mother's side, I have relatives who came from Okinawa and survived the Battle of Okinawa, and then also have relatives from Fukushima. So all of these family factors for me really helped to inform my interest in these kinds of subjects. And really at the time in which I was exploring my personal identity, there was a dearth of information about Okinawan history written in the English language, and even in the Japanese language, it was somewhat limited at that early period of time in the early 1990s. And I was able to, through my academic pursuits, begin to investigate a little of this history. And it just so happened that my investigations preceded the very horrible 1995 rape incident in Okinawa, which of course became an international cause and a point of controversy in the US-Japan security relationship. And after that time, I was a young activist and became involved with an organization known as the Okinawa Peace Network of Los Angeles. And we helped sponsor women's delegations coming to the United States, part of sort of people's or citizens' diplomacy to try to affect change in relation to these kinds of issues. And so really beyond, however, the US-Japan security relationship and beyond the issue of the military bases, which of course remains an incredibly pertinent and important issue in Okinawa, I began to kind of start to ask questions about what it is that makes Okinawa so different, why it is in my family that we often sort of talked in sort of hushed tones like, oh, you're actually part Okinawan, but no one could really tell me what that exactly meant. And I wanted to try to find out exactly what that meant. In those investigations, I began to learn a little bit about this discussion of a term that was that many people attribute to the scholar Arasaki Moriteru, and that phrase is izakaya nationalism, which is sort of an offhand or off-color kind of joke along the lines of like, if you get enough Okinawans in an izakaya drunk, that eventually they'll start talking about the golden days of the Ryukyu kingdom and the desire to form an independent Okinawa nation. And I always thought that this was a rather funny way to approach the subject of Okinawan subjectivity. And I wanted to kind of like think about it and really kind of take it seriously. What happens if we actually do try to tease out the particular history of Okinawa in relation to these questions of nationalism, and really ask the question of what it looks like and how it formed and what are the particular histories that inform it. So in terms of my project, this is primarily an intellectual and social history. And the theoretical underpinnings of this study primarily deal with concepts of sovereignty, colonialism, nationalism, decolonization, and autonomy and secession, as they apply to Okinawan history. In addressing these issues, this talk will primarily focus on two proposals that were published in the Shin Okinawa Bungaku Journal, which I loosely group under the term, quote unquote, nationalism. So the first touchstone really has to do with Japan and Okinawa from the post-war to reversion. And as many of you are here, are students of Japanese history, this is all quite familiar. The occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952, the alignment of Japan with US interests, particularly in the context of the Cold War, and of course, the Article 9 Constitution, which prohibited Japan from maintaining military forces, normalized military forces, and renouncing war as a sovereign right of the nation, all of which, of course, aligns Japan with the United States and, of course, with issues such as military troop locating. The Ryukyu Islands, of course, had a very different sort of history in the post-war period. From 1952 to 1972, for another 20 years, it remained entirely under the control of the United States and the US military presence. And so that they had a much different sort of positionality in relation to the rest of Japan. And it was really within that context of dealing with the continued presence of the US military and the military impacts on local citizenry that eventually there developed within Okinawa a movement to revert Okinawa to Japanese control. And we can see here a picture of the of the council related to that work in 1960. Moving into the 1960s, the period of the New Left, it was a very difficult time, one of incredible controversy and activism, and especially in the context of the United States deployment of forces in Vietnam, the question of the use of Okinawa as a set of military bases, especially for either refueling and also rest and relaxation activities for troops, caused incredible burdens on the local population. And we see in this image here a image of an anti-US military demonstration organized by the all military base workers union in Okinawa in 1969. So that these political activities increasingly not only made the question of Okinawa much more important and salient in the overall picture of East Asian politics, but it also made it very difficult for the United States to continue to deploy its troops from a place like Okinawa. It put pressure on the military to find an actual solution to this Okinawa question, something that had remained a sticking point, especially for the Japanese government, people like Prime Minister Sato Eisaku, who saw the return of Okinawa as completing the post-war process, ending the post-war period. And this recidivism on the part of Japan was primal in terms of the negotiations that took place between him and President Nixon of the United States, resulting in this reversion agreement, and eventually in the implementation of reversion itself. Now, once reversion is implemented, of course, it is not entirely welcomed by everyone in Okinawa. Some people did welcome it and some people did not. Many people found that the provisions of the reversion process were quite problematic. We will return to that in a little bit. And then the second touchstone is something I had already touched upon, which was, of course, this 1995 rape incident where a 12-year-old Okinawan schoolgirl was raped by 3 US Marines. This cause is picked up in a large part by women's groups in Okinawa who serve really to highlight this issue in a very large way. Protests continued to multiply over time, culminating in a protest rally of some 85,000 people, a size which was pretty much unheard of at that period of time in the 1990s. And it also included a prefecture-wide plebiscite opposing the military bases and seeking their removal. And so we have figures from the women's movement. Here on the far left side, you can see an image of Takezato Suzuyo, a very important figure in Okinawan women's circles, and as well as pictures of the demonstrations that followed, right? All of which highlighted this military base situation that continued in Okinawa as an unfair and unjust burden, where something like 70% of all of the US military troops in quote unquote Japan are actually located and sited in Okinawa. But what happened between these 2 points in time? It's something that is not covered enough in terms of Okinawan history. And how is it that all of a sudden people were able to mobilize so quickly and in such a large sense in the aftermath of this 1995 rape incident? And what I will argue is that in the 1980s, there was a significant amount of at least thought activity, work by intellectuals, scholars, and activists that began to really re-envision a sense of where Okinawa could fit within a larger global sense. In Japan, we don't get much either really about the 1980s at a certain level. So much of the image of Japan's mainland history is overshadowed by the growth of the bubble economy in the 1980s, the precipitous growth of the stock market leading up until 1990. The boom period of this time was exuberant, to say the least, as well as serving to cause a lot of discussions internationally about the growing power of Japan, the spread of Japanese consumer electronics and automobiles, something I don't have to explain to people here in Michigan, I'm sure. And of course, issues related to trade wars, and of course, related to the acquisition of large, high-profile properties by Japanese corporations. In the midst of all of this, you have Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro making remarks in September of 1986 that Japan is ethnically homogenous, a Tanitsu Minzoku kind of story about Japan. And this really was not uncommon. It mirrored an earlier 1980 reports from Japan to the United Nations, which also stated that minorities do not exist in Japan. So certainly from this point of view, Okinawa is not different. It is also not very important to care about what it is that Okinawans are doing in thinking about alternatives to Japanese rule. Now, when we think about these Okinawan independence proposals of the 1980s, there is a larger history going back into the post-war period about Okinawans pushing for Okinawan independence, although generally these movements tended to be somewhat muted. There were early Okinawan post-war political parties, some of which espoused a desire for an independent Okinawan nation state, or other configurations such as a trusteeship status, etc. And some of these were supported, for example, by statements from the mainland Japanese Communist Party, which also early on had expressed some support for Okinawan independence as well. Now, ultimately, however, following the reverse course in the US occupation policies and the heightening of the Cold War, this really put a stop in a large way to some of those earlier pronouncements and limited that growth. That said, one of the major sort of groups of people that pushed against reversion was this a group of people that we call the Han Fukironsha, basically people who supported theories opposing the reversion of Okinawa to Japan. And I wanted to kind of highlight some of them for a second here, because at a certain sense, they are really pushing for a sense of independence. Three people were most prominent in terms of this field of Han Fukiron. The first is a man by the name of Arakawa Akira. Legal institutions, etc., and all organizational systems that concentrate authority are abolished. The people of the Social Republic must smash the butt of authority in each of their hearts and be watchful. Right? He continues on to talk about the innate power of people to govern themselves, and includes articles prohibiting the killing of other people, discouraging the killing of animals, or the cultivation of plants beyond what is necessary for food, and emphasizing popular consensus in decision-making and the need to provide food, habitation, and clothing for all of its residents. But what happens if you center those kinds of beliefs as a core aspect of what you perceive of yourself in terms of your national identity, right? If you see that your national identity as an Okinawan is to be against discrimination, is to be open and welcoming, right? As a, you know, when we think about certain kinds of really central cultural phrases within Okinawan culture, like Ichariba Chode, right? Which means that once we meet, we're like brothers and sisters, right? Regardless of our relations. Or the other major phrase is Nuchi Dutakara, which says that, you know, life itself is a treasure, right? Then if you like center those kinds of concepts, I mean, you kind of have the possibility of creating a national identity, which is really challenging to many aspects of the status quo, right? And, you know, if you say life is a treasure, then how could you possibly be for war? How could you possibly be for weapons of war and the stationing of such? How can you possibly be for the status quo in terms of how people conceptualize issues of national security or things like, you know, of that sort? Of course, these scholars are not alone in terms of asking these bigger questions about why it is that we have to accept these existing logics of security. Okinawan women's groups, for example, have been very stalwart in terms of asking us to redefine security for many decades now. And so I think that it's become much more widespread as a general or common sort of framework within Okinawan circles.
Thank you for that. Realistically and politically, do you see status quo as the most viable alternative for the future of Okinawa? If not, what are the other likely scenarios? Thank you.
It is certainly a difficult conversation or a difficult question. And for myself, I try not to project so much of my personal opinion, because my view is that these decisions are going to be best made by the residents of Okinawa. You know, they're the ones who are dealing with the day-to-day issues the most and will live with the impacts of any particular political changes that might occur. You know, I'll defer to their best judgment in terms of how that plays out. In terms of the possibilities of it, a couple of aspects. One is lately, I would say in current decades in world history, many people are reticent to talk about new forms of nationalism, right? There seems to be a general unease with new emerging nationalisms and new independence struggles. Because of course, the reality of the implementation of many of those struggles historically in the world was that they were bloody and they were difficult. The situation with the military bases is ever present, and it hasn't really resolved itself in any form or fashion. Even after 1995, there's been very little progress, right, in terms of reducing the base burdens that Okinawans deal with on an everyday basis. And of course, if you've lived there, which I had the opportunity to do, you see this military presence every single day. It's so ever present in terms of your life. And not even just the US military presence, but even Japanese SDF forces are still so large, even in Okinawa as well. So I would say that lived reality and the lack of any progress in that direction, I would argue, can only continue to maintain a certain level of antipathy and dissatisfaction amongst the Okinawan population. Really, the core of it is that for a group really to claim themselves as an indigenous people, they have to have been colonized. They have to have been in control of their territory before another group of people came and took them over. And that is basically the case for Okinawa, which was, formerly independent island kingdom, the Ryukyu kingdom for several hundred years. Regardless of the fact of the dual sort of system of tributary relations that they held with China and with Japan, they still exercised a great deal of autonomy. And that, of course, was changed in 1879 when the Japanese state sent in their military and police forces to Okinawa as a threat of force, kidnapped the king, Shotai, the last king, brought him to Tokyo, placed him under house arrest, and forced him to essentially give over control of sovereignty of the Ryukyu kingdom to Japan. And so that, originary sin of colonization holds true for Okinawa in ways that it doesn't hold true for other places in Japan, except for Hokkaido or Ezo, which itself was also colonized, but through a different sort of settler colonial paradigm, as opposed to the Ryukyu kingdom, which didn't see as much of a settler colonial paradigm as Hokkaido did.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for the incredibly interesting and provocative talk. Please join me in thanking once again Dr. Ryan Masaki Yokota for his really fascinating lecture today.
Thank you.